Have you ever really stopped to think about how much the lines on a map, shape our world, way beyond just the political borders we see, or how these really ancient geographical facts still play out in modern conflicts and power dynamics, even now, with everything being so connected?
It's a powerful idea, isn't it? Kind of fundamental.
Okay, let's unpack this a bit. Today, we're doing a deep dive into geography's impact on, well, one of the most complex and vital regions anywhere, the Greater Middle East.
Right.
And we'll be putting a particular lens on Iran, its history, its culture, its geopolitical weight. Our mission here, really, is to pull out the key insights from the sources we've looked at.
Sort of a shortcut for you, yeah.
Exactly. A shortcut to getting properly informed about this critical region, and especially this idea we're calling the Iranian pivot. How Iran's unique spot on the map constantly influences the wider Middle East.
And what's really fascinating, I think, is how the map itself, when you look at it through history, it reveals these deep patterns that explain so much of what's happening right now.
Yeah.
We've drawn from some really excellent scholarly work here, deep analyses looking at exactly these historical and geographical angles. They offer some pretty compelling takes.
So get ready for maybe a few aha moments, because we're going to explore how things like mountains, deserts, even old trade routes are still defining identities and international relations for you.
In ways that might actually surprise you.
Yeah, it's really a journey into how the land itself, over thousands of years, kind of sets the stage for today's news headlines. Okay, so let's kick things off by trying to define this incredibly rich and complex area geographically.
Right. Where do we even start?
Well, the famous scholar William McNeill from the University of Chicago, he once described ancient India, China, and Greece as being like on the fringes of the anciently civilized world.
Fringes, yeah, protected.
Exactly. His argument was that these places were partly shielded by big geographical barriers, like massive mountain ranges, huge deserts, just sheer distance.
Now, obviously, that protection wasn't total, right? Greece got invaded by Persia, China had the Mongols, India saw waves of Muslim conquerors.
Sure. But McNeill's point was it was just enough. Enough for these three really unique, distinct civilizations to properly take root and flourish.
Okay, makes sense.
But that leaves a huge question mark over the massive area between them, doesn't it?
Yeah.
What was that central region? And how did its geography shape its destiny?
And that's where McNeill's colleague, Marshall Hodgson, comes in with a really key concept, the oikoumene.
Oikoumene. Okay.
Yeah, it's an Old Greek term, basically means the inhabited quarter of the world. Think Herodotus's world map, that kind of dry, temperate zone across Africa and Asia.
Right.
Hodgson also calls it the Nile to Oxus belt. So stretching all the way from North Africa right over to the edges of Western China.
Nile to Oxus.
And that vast area, that's basically what we now call the Greater Middle East. So Nile to Oxus means effectively from Egypt, which is kind of shorthand for North Africa, right up to Central Asia. And this includes both the Arab southern part, the deserts and plains, and the non-Arab northern mountainous tableland.
That northern bit.
Yeah, you could call it the Bosporus to Indus region, maybe, stretching from the Black Sea across to the Indian subcontinent. And that part, it's been really shaped by migrations out of Central Asia over centuries. Meanwhile, the whole Nile to Oxus belt, it's always felt the impact of sea traffic too, Mediterranean, Red Sea, Indian Ocean. It's always been connected globally in that sense.
So this oikoumene, or the Greater Middle East, it throws up these contradictory facts, doesn't it? It's clearly its own zone, different from Greece, China, India.
Definitely distinct.
Yet it's had this huge fundamental influence on all three of them. It seems to be a place of both, deep unity and profound division.
Exactly that. On the unity side, you've got the massive influence of Islam crossing many borders. And you also have the legacies of horse and camel nomadism.
Right, the nomadic traditions.
Yeah, they shaped societies and economies in ways that really set the oikoumene apart from the big agricultural societies in China, India, which were more settled based on crops. But, and this is critical, internally, the region is also incredibly fragmented. It's carved up by sparse rivers, scattered oases that support populations, high mountains, vast deserts.
Natural barriers within the region.
Precisely. And those features have had and still have huge consequences for political organization, even today. It makes central control really difficult.
Right.
John King Fairbank, the Harvard China expert. He drew a really stark contrast with China. He pointed to China's amazing cultural homogeneity over millennia, compared to what he called the multiplicity and diversity of peoples, states, and cultures in the ancient Middle East. From 3000 BC onwards, you had this almost constant flux. Egyptians, Sumerians, Akkadians, Assyrians, Phoenicians, Hittites, Medes, Persians.
Yeah.
The list goes on.
Just a bewildering mix.
Totally. Unlike China, where one dominant culture tended to absorb others, the Middle East saw this explosion of different languages, writing systems, religions. Fairbank called it pluralism with a vengeance.
Pluralism with a vengeance. I like that. And here's where it gets really interesting for understanding today, right?
Yeah.
This classical legacy of division, this historical pluralism, it's still here. It deeply shapes the volatile politics we see across the greater Middle East now.
Absolutely. Even though Arabic unites much of the region linguistically.
You still have Persian and Turkish dominating the northern plateau areas, not to mention all the distinct languages in Central Asia and the Caucasus.
Right. And while some modern Middle Eastern states might look like random lines drawn by colonial powers,
Which some definitely are.
many actually have quite solid foundations going back to antiquity, foundations rooted in their geography, their enduring features. This deep historical layering is just crucial to grasp.
Yeah, you can't ignore it.
And this very multiplicity of states, combined with all the powerful religious, ideological, democratizing forces swirling within them, well, it really cements its status as what the naval strategist Menhen called debatable ground.
Debatable ground.
Yeah. I mean, a fundamental, inescapable fact of our time, the 21st century, is that the most geographically central part of the dryland Earth is also, ironically, the most unstable.
Central and unstable. That's quite a combination.
It really is. Think about it. Scholars like Kemp and Harkavy, they describe the Middle East as this vast quadrilateral where Europe, Russia, Asia, and Africa all kind of crash into each other.
Okay, paint that picture.
To the west, you've got the Mediterranean and the Sahara, both connections and barriers. To the north, the Black Sea, Caucasus, Caspian, the Central Asian steppe. To the east, the huge Hindu Kush Mountains and the Indian subcontinent. And south, the vital Indian Ocean.
So it's a major intersection.
A massive intersection. And unlike China or Russia, these huge unified states projecting power fairly coherently.
Right. Or even the Indian subcontinent, dominated mostly by India. The Middle East isn't like that. It's not like Europe either, with its organized alliances like NATO or the EU.
No, it's much more fragmented.
Exactly. It's this disorderly, almost bewildering mix of kingdoms, sultanates, theocracies, democracies, military autocracies. Their borders often look shaky, like they were drawn hastily. It's a patchwork. And this whole zone, including North Africa, the Horn of Africa, Central Asia, even parts of the Indian subcontinent, forms this really densely packed axis of instability. Continents, ancient roads, crucial sea lanes all converge, creating constant friction.
Okay, so let's talk implications. What does this mean for us, practically speaking, beyond the obvious geopolitical messiness?
Well, a big one economically is energy. This region holds something like 70% of the world's proven oil reserves
70%.
and 40% of its natural gas. It's just staggering.
That concentration is incredible. But does that wealth itself add to the instability you were talking about? Are there specific pathologies linked to having all that energy? That's a crucial question. Paul Bracken at Yale, he highlights exactly that. A range of pathologies that make things worse, many tied to this resource wealth and strategic importance.
Like what?
Well, extremist ideologies often get fueled by economic problems or outside meddling linked to resources. There's the power of crowd psychology, how quickly unrest can spread.
Yeah, we've seen that.
Then there's the danger of overlapping missile ranges. A local fight could escalate terrifyingly fast. And don't forget the media, often profit-driven, biased, fanning flames instead of cooling things down. And, if you put the Korean Peninsula aside, nuclear proliferation is a bigger factor in the Middle East than anywhere else. That adds this profound existential risk.
And the resources play into that.
Partly, yes. Controlling or accessing that energy gives states the means and maybe the perceived need for those kinds of advanced weapons. It raises the stakes immensely.
And on top of all that, there's the youth bulge. Demographics.
Huge factor. An incredible 65% of the population is under 30.
65%.
And the projections are startling. Between 1995 and 2025, the populations in places like Iraq, Jordan, Kuwait, Oman, Syria, West Bank, Gaza, Yemen, they're expected to have literally doubled.
Doubled. That's immense pressure.
Immense. Young populations, as we saw with the Arab Spring, they're usually the ones pushing for change. They see the outside world, they're impatient with old systems, they face unemployment. So the next generation of rulers, whether in Iran or the Arab states, they just won't be able to rule as absolutely as their parents did. Now, organizing elections might be relatively easy.
But building stable democracies.
That's the hard part. It takes generations. What we're seeing instead in the Middle East, driven by this youth bulge and the communications revolution, is a series of these messy Mexico-style scenarios, meaning you replace these decisive, often brutal one-party states with more chaotic, multifactional systems. But critically, it's happening without Mexico's level of institutions, however limited those are, or its relatively stable neighbor.
So it's instability replacing rigid control, potentially.
Potentially much more dangerous instability. The sources suggest a future Middle East bristling with advanced weapons, maybe even WMDs. It could make the old Arab-Israeli state conflicts look almost quaint, like a sepia-toned photo from the Cold War, where things were comparatively clearer.
A sobering thought.
These internal fractured conflicts could be far, far worse.
Now, it's true that technology, emails, air travel, it's shrunk distances in some ways. Crises can spread like wildfire across the whole region now.
Definitely.
Like the Israeli flotilla incident that inflamed crowds everywhere. Turkey, Iran, Arab world. Or the Tunisian vendor setting himself on fire that sparked the Arab Spring far beyond Tunisia's borders.
Yeah, information and emotion travel fast now. The old barriers are weaker in that sense.
So this brings up a really important question. Even with all this modern connectivity seemingly flattening the world, how much can we still learn just by looking at the map, at those fundamental divisions? Do they still matter that much?
I think they absolutely do. Despite technology's impressive flattening effect, those basic geographical realities, they persist. They still exert massive influence.
Okay.
And when we look at the map of the Middle East, there are 3 geographical features that really jump out, that define the whole geopolitical landscape.
And those are?
The sprawling Arabian Peninsula, the formidable Iranian plateau, and the crucial Anatolian land bridge.
Right. 3 key zones.
And we should probably unpack each one, starting with the complexities of the Arabian Peninsula.
Okay, let's turn to the Arabian Peninsula then, which is, dominated visually on the map by Saudi Arabia.
Overwhelmingly so.
But it's a key detail, isn't it, that Saudi Arabia, with only about 28.7 million people, actually has way less than half the peninsula's total population.
That's right. The demography is just as telling as the geology, you could say.
And that population is growing fast, creating huge internal pressures.
Huge. Saudi Arabia's growth rate is nearly 2% a year. If that keeps up, the population could double in just a few decades.
Doubling in a water-starved desert.
Exactly. Imagine sustaining that many people in such an arid place. Plus, nearly 40% are under 15, and a staggering 40% of young men are unemployed.
Wow.
The political pressures from that young, restless population needing jobs, education, a future, it's going to be immense, potentially really destabilizing.
So where does Saudi power actually come from then, if not population size? Because that sounds like a liability.
It is becoming a liability. Their power traditionally comes from the oil. World leader, 262 billion barrels. And natural gas, 4th in the world, 240 trillion cubic feet.
The resource wealth.
That massive wealth is their strength. But paradoxically, it also feeds some internal problems by, maybe reducing the pressure for wider economic changes, for creating jobs outside the oil sector.
Right. So the money flows in,
right,
but the domestic pressure cooker is heating up.
Pretty much.
It's fascinating then to look at the geographical heartland of the Saudi state itself and of Wahhabism, the religious movement tied to it.
Nudge.
Yes, Central Arabia. It's this arid upland region right in the middle, between the big Al Nafud Desert north and the Rub al-Khali, the empty quarters south, Persian Gulf Coast to the east, Hejaz Mountains west.
Yeah, Najd means upland. Higher in the west, sloping down eastwards, it's defined by scarcity, real hardship.
Hardship shaping belief.
Very much so. The British explorer Charles Doughty wrote about it vividly in the 19th century. The constant labor of drawing water from wells, he said, if God had not made the camel, Najd, they say, had been without inhabitant.
Wow. Just underlines its harshness.
It really does. Najd is the absolute core of what Hodgson called camel-based nomadism. And that isolation, that harsh environment, it fostered this very rigid, puritanical form of Islam Wahhabism, viewing outsiders as corrupting.
And they launched raids from there.
Exactly. From this austere heartland, Wahhabi fanatics raided outwards, trying to purify practices they saw as idolatrous, even destroying shrines. The geography directly shaped the ideology.
Which brings us to a really important contrast, right? A deep split within Saudi Arabia itself. Najd versus the Hijaz.
Absolutely. Hijaz, next to the Red Sea, home to the holy cities, Mecca and Medina.
And unlike isolated Najd, these cities have always been crossroads.
It's a bit paradoxical, isn't it? Mecca and Medina synonymous with Muslim piety.
Yeah.
But it's the Hajj, the pilgrimage itself, bringing Muslims from everywhere, that gives these cities and the Hijaz region a kind of cosmopolitanism and openness.
Interesting.
Bruce Riedel, the CIA expert, he wrote that the Hijaz, with its young, urbane, religiously varied population, has never fully accommodated to Saudi and Wahhabi rule.
Oh, cultural tension there.
Definitely.
Oh.
Riedel says Hijazis tend to look towards the Red Sea, Egypt, Syria for cultural connection, not the austere desert of Najd. And this has been a source of friction for centuries. The basic historical pattern was the Wahhabis could never permanently hold the edges of the peninsula, but their enemies couldn't hold the Najd heartland either. A constant push and pull. And modern Saudi Arabia, shaped by Ibn Saud, who was a Najdi who conquered Hijaz in 1925, it still reflects this. The state focuses on Najd, on Riyadh. It notably doesn't include the independent coastal sheikdoms on the Gulf or Oman and Yemen. They've always kept their separate identities.
And those coastal sheikdoms, Kuwait, Bahrain, Qatar, UAE, they developed because of their location.
Precisely. They were on Britain's crucial 19th century trade routes, especially the route to India. So Britain made deals with their rulers, which led to their independence after World War II.
And then came the oil.
And then came the oil, which sealed their fate as these El Dorado states, as Peter Mansfield called them. Places of sudden incredible wealth, but also, complex vulnerability.
Okay, so within the peninsula itself, Saudi Arabia's real, maybe fundamental danger isn't from the sea or the Gulf states.
No, it's from the southwest, from Yemen.
Yemen. Why Yemen specifically?
Demographics and geography. Yemen only has about a quarter of Saudi Arabia's land area, but its population is almost as big and projected to grow even faster. So it's mountainous southwest basalt plateaus, ancient oases. That's the real demographic core of the whole peninsula, just teeming with people.
And its history is different too.
Very different. Unlike, say, Afghanistan or Nepal. Yemen was never really colonized by outside powers like the Ottomans or British, partly because it's so rugged, fiercely independent.
Right.
But the result is it never developed strong central government institutions. I remember traveling near the Saudi-Yemeni border years ago. It was just full of pickup trucks with armed young men, loyal to local sheikhs, almost no government presence.
Sounds like a tribal society heavily armed.
Exactly. Estimates put the number of guns in Yemen as high as 80 million. That's nearly 3 guns for every person.
80 million.
An American military guy in Sana'a once told me something unforgettable. He said, basically, in Yemen, you've got over 20 million aggressive, commercial-minded, well-armed people, hard-working compared to the Saudis next door. It's the future, and it terrifies Rod.
That really paints a picture. A demographic time bomb on their border.
A huge challenge right on their doorstep.
So the bottom line for Saudi Arabia, the future of this teeming, tribal, armed Yemen with weapons, explosives, quat flowing across the border.
That future will massively impact Saudi stability. And it's geography, maybe more than ideology, that drives this core tension.
Fascinating. Geography as destiny, almost. Okay, let's pivot now, appropriately enough, to the Iranian plateau and how its geography created a totally different story.
A very different trajectory, yes.
Unlike Saudi Arabia's sort of spread out oases and deserts, the Iranian plateau is pretty much synonymous with one country, Iran.
Right, a coherent geographical unit.
And its population, 74 million, is 2.5 times Saudi Arabia's, making it one of the big players in the Middle East, alongside Turkey and Egypt.
Big population, yes.
But crucially, Iran managed to get its population growth rate way down, below 1%. Only 22% under 15, which means population isn't a burden like it's becoming for the Saudis.
No, it's an asset, a potential engine for development.
Exactly, it's an asset.
Now, you could point to Turkey, maybe. Bigger population, similar low growth, higher literacy, stable agriculture, more industry.
True, but Turkey's location is different.
Totally different. Northwest of Iran, closer to Europe, further from the main Arab centers. And critically, Turkey doesn't have much oil or gas.
Where's Iran?
Iran is number 3 in the world for oil reserves, 133 billion barrels, and number 2 for natural gas, 970 trillion cubic feet. Massive reserves.
Okay.
But what's truly mind-blowing is Iran's location, its geographical advantage. It sits just south of Mackinder's heartland, that strategic core of Eurasia, and right inside Spikeman's Rimland, the coastal areas around it.
So a natural crossroads of power.
A natural pivot point. Its location, maybe more than anything else, is just something to behold. It's a bridge.
And energy-wise.
Well, think about it. Pretty much all the greater Middle East's oil and gas is either in the Persian Gulf or the Caspian Sea region.
Right. 2 huge energy zones.
And just like ships radiate from the Gulf, pipelines radiate or will radiate from the Caspian towards the Med, the Black Sea, China, the Indian Ocean.
Okay.
And the only country that strategically straddles both of these massive energy zones is Iran, stretching from the Caspian north to the Gulf south.
That gives it incredible leverage.
Immense leverage. The Persian Gulf alone has maybe 55% of the world's crude oil reserves, and Iran dominates that whole Gulf, from the Shatt al-Arab near Iraq down to the Strait of Hormuz, over 600 miles.
And its coastline is complex.
Very complex. Lots of bays, inlets, coves, islands, perfect for hiding speedboats to disrupt shipping. Its coastline inside the strait is over 1,300 nautical miles long. Compare that to the UAE's 730.
Big difference.
Huge. Plus, Iran has 300 miles of Arabian Sea coast, too, with the port of Chabahar, vital for giving landlocked Central Asian countries warm water access.
And the north, the Caspian.
Up north, its Caspian coast stretches almost 400 miles, forested mountains right behind it, from Azerbaijan border west to Turkmenistan border east.
So access north and south. What about internally?
Internally, the Zagros Mountains sweep down northwest to southeast, a big natural barrier. West of the Zagros, the roads open into Mesopotamia, Iraq. That's a historical corridor for influence and invasion.
Right. Freya Stark based herself in Baghdad.
Exactly, to explore the Zagros. While east and northeast, the roads open towards Khorasan and the big deserts of Turkmenistan and Uzbekistan.
So it connects east and west, too.
This brings up a key point. Just like Iran straddles the Gulf and Caspian energy fields, it also straddles the Middle East proper and Central Asia. No Arab country can do that.
That's a unique position.
It really is. And historically, that openness to Central Asia was also a vulnerability. The Mongol invasion was devastating, partly because Iran was geographically open that way. They destroyed the Qanat irrigation systems.
Those underground water channels?
Yeah, ingenious things. It was devastating. But the point is, while Iranian influence westwards Turkey, Arab world is well known, its potential influence north and east is just as huge.
Especially if regimes become less repressive.
Exactly. If things open up in Iran and former Soviet Central Asia, that influence could deepen dramatically. Iran could really live up to its full geographical potential then.
Okay, beyond the physical geography, there's also this idea, you mentioned the idea of Iran.
Right. Michael Axworthy, the historian, talks about this. It's not just about race or territory, it's deeper culture, language.
A civilizational magnet.
Kind of like that, yeah, like ancient Greece or China. It pulls other people's, other languages into its orbit. That's real soft power, enduring soft power.
And we see that in languages today.
Absolutely. Dari, Tajik, Urdu, Hindi, Bengali, even Iraqi Arabic, they're either variants of Persian or heavily influenced by its vocabulary and literary traditions.
Wow.
You could, sort of metaphorically, travel from Baghdad to Calcutta and still be within a Persian cultural realm. That shows its reach.
Incredible spread.
And a quick look at Iranian history shows this reach evolving. Greater Iran really starts around 700 BC with the Medes in the northwest.
Breeze, right.
By 600 BC, their empire stretched from central Turkey to the Hindu Kush down to the Gulf. Then comes Cyrus the Great, 549 BC, Achaemenid dynasty. He takes over and expands massively.
This is Persia's peak.
The Achaemenid Empire, run from Persepolis, 6th to 4th centuries BC. That's ancient Persia at its absolute height. Look at the map. Thrace, Macedonia, Libya, Egypt, all the way to the Punjab in India. North from the Caucasus, Caspian, Aral Seas, down to the Gulf and Arabian Sea.
That's vast.
Truly Bosporus to Indus, including the Nile. No empire before it matched that scale.
We tend to focus on the Greek perspective, the wars.
We do. Western bias, maybe. But Hodgson's point is crucial. The oikoumene, under the relative peace and tolerance of Achaemenid Persia and later empires, that stability provided the base for the great world religions to emerge and flourish. That order allowed spiritual movements to take root.
So that Achaemenid reach set a standard. But the Empire of Mind took other forms too, didn't it, like the Parthians?
Absolutely. The Parthians ruled from the 3rd century BC to the 3rd AD. Based in Khorasan, northeastern Iran, their model was very different.
How so?
Axworthy says they showed the best of Iranian genius, recognizing, accepting, tolerating the complex cultures they ruled.
More decentralized.
Much more. Their empire generally ran from Syria, Iraq to Afghanistan, Pakistan, including Armenia, Turkmenistan. So not quite the Achaemenid scale, but maybe a more realistic model for a 21st century greater Iran based on influence, not control.
Leaning on Greek culture too.
Yeah, they leaned heavily on Greek art, architecture, administration, blended traditions. This model of subtle influence, not rigid control, might hold lessons for Iran today.
Okay, shifting forward to medieval times, we see this idea of Iran persisting even when Arabs were nominally in charge.
Persisting powerfully. 8th century, the Arab Caliphate's center shifts east from Syria's Umayyads to Mesopotamia's Abbasids.
Closer to Persia.
Right, and this seemingly Arab shift actually marks a huge Persian resurgence, a cultural reconquest, some call it.
Cultural reconquest. Explain that.
The Abbasid Caliphate, at its height, ruled from Tunisia to Pakistan, Caucasus down to the Gulf. New capital, Baghdad, built right near the old Persian Sassanid capital.
Deliberate choice.
Very deliberate. And Persian bureaucratic methods, adding hierarchy, sophistication, imperial administration, they underpin this whole new empire.
So the structure was Persian, even if the rulers were Arab.
Largely, yes. The Abbasid Caliphate became, in many ways, more like an Iranian despotism structure, centralized, than an Arab sheikdom. Hidi noted. Persian titles, Persian wines and wives, Persian ideas and thoughts won the day.
Wow. It permeated everything.
Even architecture. Baghdad's monumental brick style, its circular plan, imitated Sassanid cities. Peter Brown at Princeton wrote that Islam owed its oriental power feel not to Muhammad, but to the massive resurgence of Eastern Persian traditions in the 8th and 9th centuries.
So Baghdad's founding was more decisive culturally than, say, battles in Europe.
Arguably, yes. Replacing Bedouin dynamism with a luxurious Persian administration reoriented the Islamic world eastward in a profound way.
And what's really amazing, showing the resilience of this idea of Iran, even the Mongol conquest in the 13th century.
Devastating. Wiped out Baghdad, wrecked Iraq's irrigation.
But Persian culture survived.
Thrived, even. Poets like Rumi, Saadi, Hafez, they continued producing incredible work after the Mongols. Even as Mesopotamia became a wreck, Persian arts and letters flourished. Must have been a bewildering time to live through, keeping track of shifting alliances.
Truly, so even under foreign empires.
Right. Persians, often nostalgic for their own past empires, kept enriching the intellectual life of non-Persian empires. Abbasid, Ghaznavid, Seljuk, Mongol, Mughal. Persian was the Mughal court language in India, Ottoman diplomatic language.
So it became an empire of the mind.
Exactly Axworthy's phrase. This potent idea magnified Iran's geographical advantages, making a greater Iran culturally seem like a natural phenomenon. Toynbee even speculated what if Tamerlane hadn't turned against Iran in 1381? Maybe we'd have seen a Soviet Union-sized state ruled by Iranians from Samarkand.
Mind-boggling alternative history. So the core insight, Iran's power is culture and language as much as land and oil. Soft power, built on attraction.
That's a huge part of it.
And when we talk about this idea of Iran, Shiism has to be part of the conversation, right? Despite the often bleak image of the clergy since 1979.
It's definitely a component. Now, the idea of the Mahdi, the hidden 12th Imam, returning to end injustice that can fuel radicalism, revolution.
Right.
But Shiism also has this quietist strain, often influenced by Sufism, where clergy accept the powers that be, work behind the scenes. Think of Ayatollah Sistani in Iraq, mostly quiet, intervening only at key moments for stability.
And Iraq and Iran are deeply linked.
Deeply. Geography, shared holy sites. It's possible that post-revolutionary Iranians might look more to Najaf and Karbala in Iraq for spiritual guidance than their own Qum might adopt Najaf's quietism. That relationship is key.
How did Shiism become so dominant in Iran, given its Arab origins?
Well, Olivia Roy points out it came late to Iran, but when the Safavids adopted it in the 16th century, they established a clerical hierarchy to help run the state.
The Safavids. They were originally Sunni Sufis.
Exactly. A militant Sufi order, mixed Turkish, Azeri, Georgian, Persian background. They conquered the Persian plateau and needed an ideology to unify it. So they adopted Twelver Shi'ism.
A political choice, then.
Largely. And it wasn't inevitable. Depends on personality, circumstances. Like an earlier Mongol ruler converting to Shi'ism helped pave the way. Shah Ismail, the Safavid founder, imposed Shi'ism and brought in Arab theologians from Lebanon and Bahrain to create a state clergy.
Cementing its role.
Cementing its role.
So connecting the dots, Shi'ism became a powerful glue for consolidating Iran as a modern nation state. Helped Persianize minorities, too.
It really did. While Iran was a great nation since antiquity, the Safavids, by embedding Shi'ism, really retooled it for the modern era, gave it a powerful ideological and institutional backbone.
Okay. Which brings us to revolutionary Iran today, a complex expression of this long legacy.
Very complex. And yes, a fitting expression in some ways. Of course, the rise of the Ayatollahs, it's done violence to Iran's more voluptuous, sophisticated traditions, the land of poets and roses image.
Right.
But comparison is key. Compared to Arab revolutions in the Cold War era, the 1979 Iranian Revolution was striking in its vitality, its modernity.
Modernity. How so?
The truth is, going way back, everything about Iran tends to be high quality. Its empires, its political thought, even, frankly, its talent for running sophisticated proxy networks, that's an aspect of imperial rule, however grim. Or the efficiency of its bureaucracy and security services. Tehran's revolutionary order was always a complex structure, not a crude one-man dictatorship like Saddam's Iraq.
And the clergy themselves.
Olivier Roy highlights the alliance between clergy and Islamist intellectuals. He argues the Shiite clergy are more open to the non-Islamic corpus than Sunni Arab scholars, says they're great readers, even of Marx and Feuerbach, like Jesuits or Dominicans, combining philosophical blending with detailed legalism.
So traditional and open to the modern world.
Roy calls it a twofold culture. That mix creates a potent intellectual force.
And that makes the Shiite imagination, as Roy calls it, more adaptable to revolution. It needs history, social justice, martyrdom.
Exactly. The Sunni Arab world, despite reformers, just didn't have the same deep exposure to Western political thinkers like Hegel and Marx for a long time. Iranian mullahs often frame their arguments in terms of history's purpose, its direction. That gives them a different kind of depth.
So it wasn't just conservative reaction.
Not entirely. Revolutionary Iran in the 80s saw itself allied with the Sandinistas, the ANC, an anti-imperialist global view. Now, clerical rule has often descended into brutal repression lately, maybe a sign of a tired regime. But even the infighting behind closed doors, it's often doctrinally complex, testament to the elevated nature of Iranian culture. The state itself is strong, organized more so than most in the region except Turkey and Israel. And the revolution didn't destroy the state, it attached itself to it, kept universal suffrage, a presidential system, even if they abused it.
The state structure remained powerful.
Very powerful, a product of history and geography. And that merger of state and clergy made the regime effective in pursuing its goals, from Lebanon to Afghanistan.
What about the Green Movement in 2009?
Another example of Iranian genius, in a way, like the regime it opposed, it was highly sophisticated for the region at the time. A world-class democracy movement using modern tech, Twitter, Facebook, effectively, and blending nationalism with universal values. It took the full force of state repression, subtle and overt, to crush it, which shows the regime's control, but also the movement's power.
Which raises a big what if, doesn't it? What if the Greens had taken power or moderated the regime?
Huge question. Iran, with its strong state and dynamic idea, could have shifted the whole Middle East away from radicalization, a potential pivot point missed.
It could have given voice to that rising middle class across the region.
Exactly. That class, often focused on economics, personal freedom, was kind of obscured by the focus on al-Qaeda until the Arab Spring. A liberalized Iran could have been a powerful magnet for them, an alternative model.
Now, here's a really interesting idea. This concept of Iran building a postmodern military empire.
Yes. First of its kind, no traditional colonies, no tanks and carriers in the usual sense.
How does that work?
Robert Baer, ex-CIA, describes it as a three-pronged strategy. Proxy warfare, asymmetrical weapons, and an appeal to the downtrodden, especially frustrated young men.
Examples?
Hezbollah in Lebanon. Baer calls it the de facto state. They're more clout than Beirut's official government. That's proxy control. In Gaza, Iran's aid and anti-colonial message attracted Palestinians alienated from nearby Sunni states like Egypt under Mubarak. Iran, miles away, felt closer. Genius unconventional power projection.
Leveraging grievances.
Precisely. Then you had friendly governments for a time in Syria and Iraq. Syria needed Iran. Iraq's politics were deeply intertwined with Iranian intelligence.
And the Gulf itself.
Iran's the only major power there. Long, complex coastline facing small, weaker Arab states. Iran can defeat them militarily, undermine them via local Shiite populations, like in Bahrain, or cripple them economically via terrorism in the Strait of Hormuz.
So what's the takeaway from this postmodern empire?
Unlike older Iranian empires often seen as benign, culturally inspiring, this one rules mainly through fear, intimidation. Suicide bombers, not poets.
And that limits it, signals its downfall.
I think so. It limits its power, makes it rely on external grievances. And fear isn't as sustainable as cultural attraction in the long run.
So the best sign that Iran hasn't reached its full potential lies where? Central Asia.
Exactly. Look at what hasn't quite happened there, despite historical ties.
Explain that.
Iran's geography gives it as much frontage on Central Asia as on the Middle East proper. The suffix Sidan itself is Persian. Persian language and culture were historically the conduits for Islam and civilization there. Elites spoke Persian for centuries.
But post-Soviet Union.
Limited gains for Iran. Azerbaijan looked to Turkey, adopted the Latin alphabet. Uzbekistan, Sunni and nationalistic, wary of clerical Iran. Tajikistan, Persian-speaking but Sunni, seeks Iran's protection, but Iran's constrained.
Why the hesitation?
Central Asians were often secularized by communism. Now relearning Islam, they're often put off by the mullah's rigidity. The cultural magnetism has been dulled by the current regime.
But Iran is building infrastructure there, leveraging its tech.
Yes, definitely positive signs for Tehran there. Iran's technologically advanced look at its nuclear program. It's building hydroelectric projects, roads, railroads in Central Asia to link them all eventually to Iran. Infrastructure is key long-term.
And energy pipelines.
Crucial. A gas pipeline from Turkmenistan to Iran frees up Iranian gas in the south for export via the Gulf. Rail links, too. Turkmenistan's committed gas exports to Iran, China, Russia.
Creating a potential Eurasian energy axis.
Yeah, potentially. An axis united by geography may be opposed to Western models. Oil pipeline with Kazakhstan, too. Swap deals. Rail links planned or built, giving Kazakhstan, even Tajikistan via Afghanistan, access to the Gulf through Iran.
So Iran is the shortest route to market for these resource-rich countries.
Geographically, undeniably. A powerful advantage.
Okay, so picture this. Iran sitting across Central Asian pipelines, plus its proxy empire in the Middle East. Sounds like a 21st century heartland pivot successor.
It have that potential, yes. But there's still that problem, that limiting factor. Iran's prestige in parts of the Arab world, South, Lebanon, Iraq, supporting Palestine, it doesn't translate well to Central Asia.
Why not?
For one, former Soviet republics have ties with Israel, lack that pervasive anti-Zionism, but it's deeper than that. It comes back to the regime itself.
Clerical rule.
The very persistence of its suffocating clerical rule. Impressive and crushing dissent, yes. But it's also dulled that linguistic, cosmopolitan appeal that historically defined Greater Iran culturally. The technicolor faded, replaced by black and white.
An anecdote illustrates this.
Yeah, I was in Ashgabat, Turkmenistan. From there, Tehran and Mashhad in Iran always seemed like big cosmopolitan centers. But while trade deals happened, Iran held no real magic for the Turkmens, mostly secular, put off by the mullahs. The regime's ideology is a barrier.
So the potential is huge, but untapped.
Absolutely. As much influence as Iran has now through defiance, we won't see its true cultural appeal until the regime liberalizes or falls.
A democratic Iran could energize Muslims everywhere.
Potentially. In the Arab world, Central Asia, offering a powerful, homegrown model of modernity. It might even catalyze Sunni Arab liberalism, challenge police states in Central Asia where Western efforts failed.
And Iraq remains key to Iran's fate.
Entwined like no other country. History, geography, the Shiite shrines in Najaf and Karbala in Iraq offer theological alternatives to Qom in Iran, creates a natural rivalry or alternative pole.
So if Iraqi democracy brings stability, its freer atmosphere could impact Iran.
Indirectly, yes. A democratic Iraq could become an attractor force for Iranian reformers, a reverse influence.
How might that play out?
As Iranians get more involved in Iraqi politics, the sheer proximity, the long border, might actually undermine the more repressive system in Iran. Interaction with a pluralistic Arab Shiite society could expose Iranians to new ideas.
And resentment could build.
Definitely. As Iran's economy struggles, people might resent money spent buying influence in Iraq or Lebanon. Iranians could become the ugly Americans in Iraq, hated for interfering.
So Iran gets stuck managing Iraqi politics.
Could be. Trying to form shaky Sunni Shiite coalitions, keeping them going, while Iraqis resent the intrusion. It's a complex entanglement.
A provocative thought emerges here.
Which is?
Without justifying the 2003 Iraq invasion, maybe, just maybe, in the long run, Saddam's fall starts a process that liberates two countries.
It's possible. Geography facilitating Iran's influence in Iraq could also facilitate Iraq's influence back on Iran, maybe pushing it towards openness. An unintended consequence, perhaps. Hashtag tag outro.
Okay, let's recap. What we've really dug into is Iran's central, pivotal role, shaped by its unique geography, its deep history of cultural pull, its amazing human capital. It really sits at a crossroads, impacting the whole region.
It truly does. And yet, while geography dictates that Iran will be pivotal, maybe even how it will be pivotal. It cannot dictate for what purpose it will be pivotal. That comes down to human decisions, choices made by people.
History shows this.
Absolutely. Think of Nader Shah in the 18th century. Brilliant conqueror, Persian Empire from Caucasus to Indus. He besieged Baghdad, Basra, Kabul, places familiar today.
Right.
Axworthy argues if Nader Shah hadn't gone mad late in life, he might have created a modernizing Iranian state capable of resisting British and Russian colonialism later. Instead, misrule and disaster. A potential turning point missed.
Or the fall of the Shah in 1979.
Kissinger suggested better handling by the U.S. might have seen the Shah survive, Iran becoming like South Korea, dynamic, imperfect democracy, basically an ally. Maybe simplistic, but it highlights possibilities.
Iran seemed less anti-American then.
In the 90s, traveling there after Egypt, Iran felt much less so. Its relationship with Jews was historically benign, right up through the Shah. There's immense potential in the population.
And other missed opportunities. Post 9/11.
Huge ones. Both Khamenei and Khatami condemned al-Qaeda. Iranians held vigils for victims while some Arab crowds cheered. Iran helped the U.S. against the Taliban, offered talks after Baghdad fell in 2003.
So history didn't have to turn out this way.
Exactly. Other outcomes were always possible. Human agency matters.
So, looking ahead, what are the future possibilities? Is peaceful change in Iran plausible?
Still more plausible, arguably, than it was in the Soviet Union during the Cold War, and a liberated Iran alongside less autocratic Arab governments.
What would that mean for the region?
It could foster a more fluid Sunni-Shiite balance, keep the region focused more on its own dynamics, less obsessed with America or Israel.
And culturally?
A more liberal Tehran could inspire a cultural continuum worthy of the old Persian empires, not constrained by clerical reactionaries. Let the arts and ideas flourish again.
But a liberal Iran might also be less centralized.
Very possible. With large Kurdish, Azeri, Turkoman minorities, maybe the peripheries drift. Iran has often been more like an amorphous multinational empire than a rigid state, culturally expansive.
Returning to that Parthian style, perhaps.
Perhaps. Less defined by hard borders, more by cultural pull, as extremism fades and the regime's legitimacy erodes further. Its true size, always both greater and smaller than the lines on the map.
So much potential there.
Which leaves us with a final thought, really. A question. If the battle for Eurasia is fought on many fronts, but maybe the most important is for the hearts and minds of Iranians,
then how will it play out?
How will that tension between the seemingly irresistible forces of geography and the simple thread of human choice ultimately shape the future? For a people, for a region so incredibly rich in history and potential.
That's definitely something for you, our listeners, to mull over. Keep thinking about these connections, deep history, geography, human decisions. We'll be back soon with another deep dive.